So, this is the part 2 of the video of modern Indian history, and here I'll be discussing about Portuguese and Dutch. So, let's start. Well, the story of Portuguese in India is actually very interesting, and it all started from 1498 when Vasco da Gama, who was a Portuguese explorer, and he arrived in Calicut on the southern west coast of India. So, first of all, let's see the background and the history of all the Portuguese and the reason behind them to invade India. So, in the late 15th century, Portugal was a very small but ambitious kingdom, and for centuries, Europe had relied on a network of overland routes like the Road to trade with the East, especially for valuable spices. And at that time, in Portugal, there was a young prince named Henry, who was also known as Henry the Navigator, who grew up hearing tales of distant lands, and he dreamed of making his country a center of exploration. Though he never sailed far himself, but he invested in building schools for navigation and supporting brave explorers who sailed down the African coast and hoped to find a way to reach India by sea. So, over the years, Portuguese ships ventured farther south along the African coastline. Each expedition added to the map and knowledge of the sea. The Portuguese, with the study, with the ships and skilled navigators, and they slowly pushed past the coast of Africa, crossing unknown waters, and finally, in 1488, a Portuguese explorer named Bartholomew Dias, he became the first to round the southern tip of Africa, which he later named as Cape of Storms because of the wild waves and winds. But at that time, King John II of Portugal, he sensed the significance of the discovery and he renamed it as the Cape of Good Hope. Then, after a few years later, a new king named Manuel I, and he took the throne in Portugal, and he was so eager to fulfill Portugal's dream of reaching India. So he appointed a seasoned sailor, and he was named Vasco da Gama to lead an expedition. And the Vasco da Gama, who was a tall, determined man with a love for adventure, and he gathered a crew of the bravest sailors and the most experienced navigators. And in July 1497, Vasco da Gama and his fleet set sail from Lisbon. Then the journey was long and full of hardship, and they sailed down the coast of Africa, past the lands already mapped by earlier explorers. They faced storms, scurvy, and navigated vast. But Vasco da Gama pressed on, and in November, after months of travel, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and ventured into the Indian Ocean. For days, they saw only endless waves until finally they reached the coast of East Africa. And there, the locals spoke of an ancient network of cities that traded with India, Arabia, and beyond. And Vasco da Gama made allies with some of the rulers and gathered valuable information about the route to India. Then, in the bustling port city of Malindi, he was welcomed by the Sultan, who also gave him an experienced Indian navigator to guide him across the Arabian Sea. Then, after a month long voyage across the open ocean, Vasco da Gama ships reached the shores of Calicut on the Malabar coast of India in May 1498. For the Portuguese, it was a moment of triumph, and they had finally discovered the long sought sea route to India, a route that bypassed the treacherous deserts and the control of Arab, who were the monopolies at that period, and Venetian merchants. And they reached Calicut, and in Calicut, the Zamorin, the king of Calicut at that period, he greeted Vasco da Gama with a mix of curiosity, and though they did not speak the same language, the two communicated through translators. The Zamorin was unimpressed with the gifts Vasco da Gama offered. Then he compared to the wealth of spices, jewels, and fabrics in India. However, Vasco da Gama eventually succeeded in securing permission to trade by Jamorin, and the Portuguese sailors loaded their ships with precious spices, especially black pepper, before setting sail for home. Then the journey back was equally treacherous because the battle storms, sickness. Then we can conclude that Vasco da Gama's voyage marked the beginning of Portugal dominance in the Indian Ocean trade, and the Portuguese not only grew wealthy from spices but also they established a vast empire that would influence the Indian subcontinent and other regions for centuries. So that was the background and the motif. Now we'll study about the period of Portugal establishment in India. So, the sequence of Portuguese officials in India during the early stages of their rule starts with Francisco de Almeida, followed by Afonso de Albuquerque, and then Nuno da Cunha. So, first we'll see about Francisco de Almeida, and he was actually appointed as the first viceroy of Portuguese in India in 1505, and he was also known for implementing the blue water policy, which aimed at maintaining Portuguese dominance over the seas and securing Portuguese trade routes. And he built fortifications along the coast to protect Portuguese interests and focused on naval supremacy to keep other European powers and Arab traders in check. And his tenure was ended in 1509 after a conflict with the Portuguese crown's evolving strategy in India. After the number two, we have is Alfonso de Albuquerque. So he succeeded Almeida and he became the second viceroy, and he was instrumental in expanding Portuguese influence in India. He captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur in 1510 and established it as the headquarters of Portuguese India and turned it into a major trade and military hub. And after that, strategic locations like Malacca, he secured that locations in 1511, and Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, and a Portuguese control over crucial trade routes. So he had a major role in achieving that routes. And also the other important contribution of him was actually, he was so focused on creating fortified colonies and spreading Christianity and fostering relations with local Indian communities through alliances like marriage and all, treaties and all. After the number third, we have Nuno da Cunha. So he served as the Portuguese governor of India after Albuquerque, and he expanded Portuguese influence along the western coast of India. Then he captured the island of Diu, which was a strategic port in Gujarat in 1535, and he strengthened Portuguese control over the western sea routes. And he focused on enhancing Portuguese trade and was very much focused on fortified and maintaining Portuguese dominance in the country. So we can say that these officials which were appointed in India were pivotal in establishing and expanding Portuguese influence in India, and it laid the foundation for their prolonged presence, especially in regions like Goa, Daman, and Diu. So that was it. Now we'll study about Dutch. So Dutch arrived in India during the 17th century in order to secure spice trade routes. So it all started in 1602. The Dutch formed a Dutch East India Company to establish and control their spice trade in Asia. So, the powerful trading company was created through the union of several smaller companies, and they established their first factory in Masulipatam on the Coromandel coast in 1605. And from there only, they began establishing trade routes and setting up trading factories. So, after Masulipatam, they started a trading center in Pulicat. So Pulicat became the second major Dutch stronghold on the Coromandel coast, and the town soon became the center of Dutch operations in India. Then a major port was made on the western coast, that is in Surat, which was very essential for securing Dutch trade in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. Then, near the present day of Calcutta, in Sinsura, in the year 1653, the Bengal factory became another important base for the Dutch. Then, captured from the Portuguese in the later years, a town named Negapatnam, which strengthened their presence, the Dutch presence on the Coromandel coast. So, all these are trading centers of the Dutch in India. So, now we'll see about the golden era of Dutch trade in India. The mid 17th century marked the peak of Dutch power in India. Their control over trade extended from the Coromandel coast and Bengal to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, and they monopolized the spice trade for a period and successfully exported large quantities of spices, textiles, and other goods to Europe. So, in brief, actually, we'll be discussing this Dutch. So, now we'll see decline of Dutch power in India. So, by the end of the 17th century, the Dutch faced multiple challenges. So, Dutch had a rivalry with the English East India Company. So, the English, they were better equipped and with stronger support from the British Crown, increasingly challenged the Dutch in India. And the Battle of Hooghly in 1759 marked a significant turning point where the Dutch were defeated by the English, and signal it was like a signal at the end of their influence in Bengal. So, after the Battle of Hooghly and the growing dominance of the British, the Dutch influence in India declined, and by the late 18th century, they lost most of their Indian holdings. And the English East India Company acquired Negapatnam in 1781 and Sinsura in 1795, further consolidating British control in India. And Dutch ultimately withdrew from the India to focus on their positions in Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies, which is modern day called as Indonesia, where they retained influence until the 20th century. Actually, there were other reasons as well, like shifts in trade priorities, like the Dutch were more interested in the spice trade in the Indonesian archipelago and focused their resources there. And this allowed the British to slowly dominate the Indian trade routes. And internal problems like they face corruption, mismanagement, financial issues, which weaken their ability to compete with other powers, and eventually their declination in India took place. So that's all about Portuguese and Dutch. After that, we'll be discussing about France and British. That's all. Thank you.